Hello, Erin from Morehouse Farm here, and today we are going to stitch up the shoulder seams of the cancan lace top. And I have left a long enough tail to do my darning here, and all I'm going to do is take it from the corner of one piece. I have laid them out right sides together, so we're just going to stitch up this shoulder seam. And I want to show you how easy this is. If you haven't left a long tail, go ahead and cut a piece of yarn that's about twice the length that you need to sew up. I'm going to do about 9 inches here. And then you're going to attach it firmly at one corner. You'll take your darning needle and you'll find the exact corner of the other so that you can have a really good solid anchor point on the edge that makes sure it goes right to the edge. And we will make that our first stitch. Then we're going to go underneath the bind off on both front and back. And if you don't quite see it, look for the little V that's created right there. All right, so that comes over on this side. And then we're just going to do a running stitch underneath, underneath, and so forth all the way until we get to the end. Now, because it's lace and it's super lightweight, we don't need to do every single stitch multiple times. I'm just going to grab a pair and go with it. If you're doing it in the 2-ply, you can absolutely do the same thing. It's not a heavy garment, so it doesn't need a ton of extra reinforcement. We just want to make sure that it's enough to hold things together and make sure it doesn't fall off your shoulders. And we'll continue this on until we reach the amount that we want. The pattern says 9.5 inches. I'm going to leave a little bit bigger opening just because my shoulders are a little bit bigger and I want to be able to get my head through. And if you run into a situation there where it looks like you've only got one leg of the stitch, just peel it apart a little bit so you can find the half that goes together. And the reason that we're doing this with the wrong sides together is so that we can hide this seam and this running stitch that I'm doing. It'll be on the inside of the garment. And that means we won't have to look at it. It'll also give us a place to hide the yarn at the very end, which is harder and harder to do in a lace garment, especially when you're using really fine yarn, because there's just not as much solid space compared to open space. But don't let that deter you, because we can absolutely find ways to darn in those ends. And every once in a while, the other thing I like to do is just stretch it sideways, make sure I haven't pulled everything too tight, very much like working in Fair Isle knitting, so that I know that my garment will stretch the same way that my seam is. And again, making sure you're getting both halves. This one seems to want to roll inward, so I just keep rolling it back out a little bit. And that's probably 5 inches, got a little bit further to go. I've already done the other side, so I can just use that as a match when I'm ready. I've sewn it up to here, looks like. So I've got a little bit further to go. And I'll just keep on keeping on. Not too tricky. And you can tell that while it's holding it together, it's not really that noticeable. And again, since it'll be on the inside, not going to be very noticeable at all. All right, so we're getting awfully close here. Maybe another 2-3 stitches. And yes, I am doing it at an angle. That's a great question. I think it just gives it a little bit more of a running effect there. So once we're ready to stop the darning, I'm just going to pull it through in a knot. Make sure I don't have my tail caught. Okay, and then we're just going to tuck it in here by following along with the stitches. And the more we can follow the stitch in a duplicate stitch fashion, the easier time we're going to have of hiding the end. And I'm sort of following the bind off stitch here. However, you can tuck it in underneath, and I realize that's really hard to see with the pink, which is exactly what we want. So I'm trying to follow the bind off, come back here, right, and then bring it back up in this direction. And the reason I'm doing that is that's a really good way to parallel any of the stitch work that you've done before and not only hide it, but it also gives it extra strength because it's, as far as holding it, the ends in, because that's where we know this yarn already follows in that stitch pattern. And then when you're ready, you can tuck it under one last one, and we'll grab the scissors, snip it, and there's our shoulder seam. So then, when we're ready to turn it inside out, voila, a nice, pretty shoulder seam. You can see it's got the little crisscrosses the way that I was darning it in. Another option would be to do a Kitchener if you want it to stay looking in the same stitch pattern, but I thought this one gives it a little bit of character on a lace flare pattern. All right, happy sewing from Morehouse Farm.